Thomas Griffin's lungs burned as he pushed his aging body through the dense Washington forest. The late autumn rain soaked through his weathered jacket, each droplet feeling like tiny daggers against his skin in the biting cold. At 68, he wasn't built for running anymore, but necessity had a way of reviving old abilities. Behind him, voices called through the trees. Hunters, not for deer or elk, but for him and what he carried. "The old man can't have gone far," a voice shouted closer than Thomas would have liked. "Fan out!" Thomas clutched the leather medicine pouch tighter to his chest. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilskin, were the fruits of 3 years' solitary work. Rare herbs cultivated in secret, processed using knowledge passed down through generations of healers. Knowledge the new Pack Council had deemed outdated and superstitious. His boot slipped on wet pine needles, sending him tumbling down a short embankment. Pain shot through his right side as he landed awkwardly against an exposed root. Thomas bit back a curse, knowing sound carried far in these woods. Years as a military medic had taught him to evaluate injuries quickly. Bruised ribs, possibly cracked, but nothing broken. He could keep moving. The voices grew more distant as the hunter spread out, unsure of his direction. Thomas allowed himself one deep breath, then scanned his surroundings. 50 yards ahead, barely visible through the curtain of rain, was the entrance to a small cave system he had discovered decades ago. Few in the Evergreen Pack knew of its existence. Staying low, Thomas made his way toward the cave, each step deliberate and silent, despite the pain in his side. Once inside, he retreated to a narrow chamber he knew would be dry. His hands, though weathered and spotted with age, moved with practiced precision as he unpacked his emergency medical supplies. "Still got it, old man," he muttered to himself, applying antiseptic to a gash on his forearm he hadn't even noticed in his flight. The sting was clarifying, focusing his mind on immediate needs. Thomas had spent his life healing others, first soldiers on battlefields, then Pack members, as their trusted healer. Now, in the twilight of his years, he found himself alone, treating his own wounds in a cave while hiding from the very Pack he had served faithfully for decades. As he wrapped a bandage around his arm, memories of another time surfaced. Hiding in a similar cave with 3 wounded men under his care, enemy forces searching the jungle outside. He had been younger then, but just as determined to protect what was precious. Back then, it was the lives of his fellow soldiers. Today, it was something potentially more valuable, a formula that could restore what many aging werewolves thought lost forever, their ability to shift forms. The sound of distant thunder rolled through the cave. Thomas closed his eyes and allowed himself to remember how it all began. 6 months earlier, Thomas had lived a quiet life in his cabin on the eastern edge of Evergreen Pack territory. The modest structure sat nestled among towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks, far enough from the main Pack compound to afford him the solitude he had grown to prefer since Martha's passing 3 years ago. His days followed a predictable pattern: dawn rising, tending to his garden of medicinal herbs, occasional visitors seeking his healing expertise, and evenings spent documenting centuries of Pack medical knowledge into notebooks that no one seemed interested in reading. That particular morning had begun like any other. Thomas had been harvesting moonberries from the patch behind his cabin when a sleek black SUV pulled up his gravel driveway. Few Pack members drove out to see him anymore, especially not in vehicles that cost more than what most people earned in several years. From the SUV emerged Victor Hayes, the newly appointed head of the Pack Council. At 48, Victor represented the new direction of the Evergreen Pack, corporate, efficient, modern. His tailored suit seemed out of place among the wild beauty of the forest, like a shark swimming through a mountain stream. "Dr. Griffin," Victor called, using Thomas's formal title with a subtle condescension that suggested it was a relic much like the man himself. "Beautiful morning for gardening." Thomas straightened slowly, his back protesting the movement after an hour bent over the moonberry bushes. He wiped his soil-covered hands on his worn jeans. "Victor," he acknowledged with a nod. "Surprising to see you out this way. Council members don't usually concern themselves with the Pack's borders these days." Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The Council concerns itself with the Pack's future, which is why I'm here." He glanced at Thomas's garden with thinly veiled disdain. "The Council has voted to modernize our medical facilities. We're bringing in specialists from Seattle. Latest equipment, pharmaceutical connections, the works." Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "I see. We're grateful for your traditional services over the years, Victor continued, examining his manicured nails. But the younger generations need medical care that aligns with the 21st century. Herbs and poultices had their time, but science has moved on. The pack needs to move with it. And my position, Thomas asked, already knowing the answer. We're creating an emeritus role for you. Ceremonial, of course. You'll receive a stipend, and you're welcome to continue your gardening hobby. Victor gestured vaguely at the moonberries. The transition takes effect immediately. Sarah Chen will be taking over as head medical officer, Harvard-trained. Impressive resume. The dismissal hung in the air like the scent of decay. 50 years of service to the pack reduced to a gardening hobby. Thomas had simply nodded. I'll need to gather my things from the pack clinic. Already boxed up, Victor replied, checking his watch. They're being delivered here this afternoon. After Victor left, Thomas had stood motionless in his garden for nearly an hour, the moonberries forgotten in his basket. It wasn't just the loss of position that hollowed him out. It was the casual erasure of generations of knowledge. Knowledge that had saved countless pack members when modern medicine had no answers for werewolf physiology. That night, as rain lashed against his cabin windows, Thomas had unpacked the boxes from the clinic. Among his belongings was a leather-bound journal that had belonged to his grandfather, filled with formulas and observations dating back to the 1880s. One entry in particular caught his attention. Notes on a rare combination of herbs that allegedly helped older werewolves maintain their shifting abilities well into advanced age. For most werewolves, the ability to shift forms began to wane after 60, becoming more painful and eventually impossible. Many elders in the pack, including several on the council, had already lost this fundamental aspect of their identity. It was one of the cruelest ironies of their kind to live longer than humans, but to lose what made them werewolves while still alive. Thomas had turned the fragile pages, carefully reading his grandfather's meticulous notes. The formula required rare ingredients, precise preparation, and patience. But if it worked? In that moment, surrounded by the physical evidence of his obsolescence, Thomas had made a decision. He would prove the value of traditional healing. He would show the pack Victor that the old ways still held power. He would find a way to help the elders shift again. The cave had grown colder as twilight approached. Thomas's ribs ached, but the hunters had long since moved on, searching other areas of the forest. He repacked his medical supplies, knowing he couldn't stay much longer. Despite the danger, he needed to check on Aria before returning to his cabin. Aria Harper. The thought of the young woman brought a rare smile to Thomas's weathered face. 22 years old and more gifted with herbs than anyone he had trained in decades. The Omega girl had been coming to his cabin for almost a year now, silently absorbing every lesson he could offer. Silent because Aria hadn't spoken a word since witnessing her parents' fatal car accident 6 years earlier. The trauma had locked her voice away, earning her the pack's pity at first, then their dismissal as the defective Omega. Her inability to speak had made her an outcast among a species that relied heavily on vocal communication, especially during shifts. Thomas had seen something different in her: keen intelligence, gentle hands, perfect for delicate work with herbs and eyes that missed nothing. He had taught her sign language, creating a private form of communication between them. In Aria, Thomas saw not just a student, but the future of traditional healing. She was his legacy, whether the pack understood that yet or not. Checking that the coast was clear, Thomas emerged from the cave. Darkness was falling, but his eyes adjusted quickly, one of the few werewolf traits that hadn't diminished with age. He oriented himself and began the long walk to Aria's small cottage, taking a circuitous route to avoid any lingering hunters. The choosing ceremony would be tomorrow night. After 6 failed attempts, Aria would once again stand among the unmated Omegas, hoping an Alpha or Beta would select her as a mate. Thomas knew the cruel reality few wanted. An Omega who couldn't cry out during the mating bond, couldn't sing pack songs, couldn't even whisper endearments. It was why he had decided to bring her as his guest. At least with him beside her, the whispers might be less vicious. The lights of Aria's cottage appeared through the trees as Thomas approached. Situated on the very edge of packlands, it was almost as isolated as his own cabin. Her grandfather Thomas's old friend had left it to her when he passed the only inheritance for a girl the pack had largely forgotten. Thomas knocked softly on the wooden door. Through the window, he could see Aria working at her table, grinding herbs with the mortar and pestle he had given her last winter solstice. Her head lifted at the sound, wariness evident in her posture until she recognized him. The door opened and Aria's eyes widened at his bedraggled appearance. Her hands moved quickly in their private sign language. What happened? You're hurt. Had a disagreement with some of Victor's men, Thomas replied, stepping inside. The cottage was warm, scented with the familiar aromas of dried herbs and wood smoke. Nothing serious. They objected to my botanical research. Aria's expression darkened. She gestured again, her movements sharp with anger. They have no right. Your knowledge belongs to you. Knowledge belongs to those who value it, Thomas corrected gently, easing himself onto a chair by the hearth. And you, my dear, value it more than most. Aria brought him tea, a special blend of her own creation that Thomas recognized as containing willow bark for pain and valerian for calm. She had learned well. As he sipped the hot liquid, he noticed she was already gathering supplies to tend to his injuries. The choosing ceremony is tomorrow, he said, watching her efficient movements. Are you prepared? Aria's hands stilled, her shoulders tensed, then she shrugged, a deliberately casual gesture betrayed by the tightness around her eyes. It doesn't matter. No one will choose the silent Omega. Their loss, Thomas said firmly. But I'd still like to accompany you, if you'll have a battered old wolf as your escort. A soft smile touched her lips as she signed, I would be honored. As Aria cleaned and rebandaged his wounds with gentle precision, Thomas found himself hoping that tomorrow might bring a change in her fortune. The pack's dismissal of Aria mirrored their treatment of him, both deemed irrelevant for what they lacked, rather than valued for what they offered. There's something else, Thomas said as she finished tending to his ribs. I want you to take this. From his pocket, he withdrew a thin leather bracelet. It had been Martha's, a simple band embossed with a pattern of healing herbs. My wife wore this for 40 years. Before her, my mother. It's said to protect the wearer's true self, even when others would deny it. He held it out. I'd like you to have it for tomorrow. Aria's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she accepted the gift, her fingers tracing the intricate pattern. She slipped it onto her wrist, then embraced Thomas, carefully mindful of his injuries. In that moment, Thomas felt a certainty that had eluded him since his dismissal from the Pack Clinic. Whatever Victor and the Council believed, the old ways weren't dead. They lived on in Aria, in her skilled hands and compassionate heart. She was proof that some things were worth preserving. As he left her cottage an hour later, Thomas felt a strange prickling at the back of his neck, an old sensation he recognized from his military days. The feeling of being watched. He scanned the tree line but saw nothing in the gathering darkness. Still, the sensation lingered as he made his way home, a warning that tomorrow would bring more than just the choosing ceremony. The great hall of the Evergreen Pack stood at the center of their territory, a massive structure of stone and timber that had been expanded over generations. Tonight it blazed with light, every window glowing against the early evening sky. The choosing ceremony was the Pack's most important annual event, the night when unmated alphas and betas selected Omega partners, forming bonds that would strengthen the Pack for another generation. Thomas adjusted his formal jacket, one of the few items of clothing he owned that wasn't practical workwear. Beside him, Aria walked with her head high, despite the whispers that followed their entrance. She wore a simple dress of deep green, her dark hair arranged in an intricate braid adorned with tiny white flowers. Martha's bracelet circled her wrist, a talisman against the judgment that surrounded them. The hall was already crowded, filled with the scent of pine roasting meat and the collective anticipation of the Pack. Near the center, the unmated Omegas gathered, dressed in their finest scents, deliberately enhanced to attract potential mates. Aria would join them soon, but for now, she remained at Thomas's side. Dr. Griffin, surprising to see you here. Thomas turned to find Logan Reed watching them. At 28, Logan was one of Victor's most loyal supporters on the Council, young, ambitious, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He had once been promised to Aria in an arrangement made by their parents during childhood. When she lost her voice, Logan had publicly broken the engagement, declaring her damaged goods. Logan, Thomas acknowledged coolly. The ceremony is open to all Pack members, I believe. Logan's gaze slid to Aria, his lip curling slightly. Of course, though some attendees might find the evening frustrating. especially when they can't participate fully in the bonding rituals. Thomas felt Aria stiffen beside him. Before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Reed, I believe your presence is required by the council." Marcus Turner stood nearby, his posture military straight despite being in his mid-40s. The pack's head of security had served in the same war as Thomas, though decades later. A bond of respect had always existed between them, even after Thomas's removal from his position. Logan hesitated, then inclined his head stiffly. "Dr. Griffin, Aria." He departed without waiting for a response, disappearing into the crowd. "That boy needs lessons in respect," Marcus muttered once Logan was out of earshot. "Those lessons would be wasted," Thomas replied. "But I appreciate the intervention." Marcus's eyes crinkled slightly. "Least I could do. You patched me up enough times after border skirmishes." His expression grew more serious. "Be careful tonight, Doc. There's tension in the council. Something's brewing." Before Thomas could ask for clarification, a hush fell over the hall. The Alpha King had arrived. Ethan Blackwood moved through the crowd with the fluid grace of a predator power evident in every controlled movement. At 30, he embodied the perfect alpha, tall, broad-shouldered, with an aura of authority that commanded respect without effort. His dark hair was cut short, emphasizing the sharp angles of his face. But it was his eyes that held everyone's attention, a rare silver gray that seemed to glow in the firelight. Thomas had known Ethan since birth, had treated his childhood illnesses and training injuries, had watched him grow from a solemn boy into a formidable leader after his father's death 5 years ago. Despite the changes in the pack's governance structure with increasing power, ceded to the council, Ethan remained their Alpha King, the final authority in matters of pack law and defense. He was also unmated despite attending the choosing ceremony for the past decade. Rumors spoke of a curse that his fated mate had died before he could find her, leaving him with half a soul and a temperament as unforgiving as a winter storm. Thomas knew better. Ethan wasn't cursed. He was waiting. For what Thomas wasn't certain, but he recognized the watchfulness in those silver eyes, the same look his grandfather had described in the journals when writing about wolves who sensed their true mates existed but hadn't yet found them. Ethan took his place on the raised dais at the front of the hall, nodding to the assembled council members. Victor stepped forward, arms spread wide in welcome. "Brothers and sisters of the Evergreen Pack, welcome to the choosing ceremony. Tonight we continue a tradition older than any of us, the sacred bonding of Alpha, Beta, and Omega that keeps our bloodline strong and our pack united." The formal words washed over the crowd. Thomas felt a tug at his sleeve as Aria signed quickly. "I should join the others." He squeezed her hand. "Remember what I told you. Stand tall. You have nothing to be ashamed of." Aria nodded, her chin lifting slightly. As she moved toward the center of the hall, where the other unmated Omegas gathered, Thomas noticed how the others subtly shifted away, leaving a small, empty space around her. The isolation was deliberate, cruel in its casualness. The ceremony began with Victor calling forth the first Alpha, a young man from a prominent family. He surveyed the gathered Omegas, then called a name. A pretty blonde stepped forward, blushing with pleasure. The hall erupted in practiced applause. A match was made. One by one, Alphas and high-ranking Betas stepped forward to make their choices. With each selection, the group of Omegas thinned. The sense of anticipation began to curdle into the sharp tang of desperation among those remaining. Thomas kept his eyes on Aria, willing her to maintain the dignity she had shown thus far. Ethan remained seated, watching the proceedings with detached interest. 10 years of ceremonies, and he had yet to choose a mate. The council's frustration was evident in Victor's tight smile whenever he glanced at their king. As the ceremony progressed, Thomas found himself drifting closer to the side of the dais where he could overhear the council's murmured conversations. Old habits from his military days, gathering intelligence through careful observation, had never quite left him. "This is the 3rd year with declining birth rates," an older council member was saying to Victor. "Without new matings, especially from strong bloodlines like the Blackwoods, we face a slow death." Victor's response was too low to catch, but his expression as he looked at Ethan was calculating. Thomas had seen similar looks during his time as a medic officer planning operations that would risk soldiers' lives for strategic advantage. A movement across the hall caught Thomas's attention. Through a side entrance, 3 strangers slipped in, 2 men and a woman dressed well enough to blend with the crowd, but with an unfamiliar scent that marked them as outsiders. The woman's eyes scanned the room with practiced efficiency before settling on Ethan. Thomas frowned. Security at the ceremony was typically tight. Visitors from other packs were required to announce themselves formally. These three had the furtive movements of those who had entered uninvited. He began making his way toward Marcus, intending to alert him to the presence of strangers when Victor called for silence. And now, as tradition dictates, our Alpha King will have the opportunity to select a mate should any of the remaining Omegas please him. All eyes turned to Ethan, who rose with fluid grace. For the first time that evening, genuine interest flickered in his silver gaze as he surveyed the remaining Omegas, now just 5 young women including Aria. Ethan stepped down from the dais, moving slowly among the Omegas. He stopped briefly before each one exchanging a few words, inhaling their scent. The ritual was ancient, predating even the formal structure of the ceremony. When he reached Aria, a hush fell over the hall. She stood, straight eyes downcast, as protocol demanded, the white flowers in her dark braid trembling slightly with her controlled breathing. Ethan paused longer before her than he had with the others. Thomas saw his nostrils flare slightly as he took in her scent. Then something extraordinary happened. Ethan reached out his fingertips lightly, touching Aria's chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. It was an intimate gesture, one typically reserved for after a choice had been made. The entire hall held its breath as silver eyes met deep brown. Thomas felt it before he saw it, a shift in the air, a change in the ambient energy of the room. Ethan's pupils dilated, his body going completely still in the way of predators who have sighted prey. But it wasn't predatory interest in his expression, it was recognition. Profound, soul-deep recognition. Aria's eyes widened. Her lips parted slightly, though no sound emerged. The moment stretched electric with possibility. Then Victor stepped forward, breaking the spell. "My king, perhaps you would like to continue your consideration. There are other suitable candidates awaiting your attention." Ethan's hand dropped from Aria's face. His expression shuddered, becoming once again the mask of detached authority. Without another word, he moved on to the next Omega. But Thomas had seen it. The flicker of something ancient and powerful. The reaction that confirmed what he had suspected since Aria first came under his tutelage. She was Ethan's fated mate. The ceremony concluded without Ethan making a selection, his 10th year of abstention. The remaining Omegas, including Aria, were claimed by Betas, all except for her. The traditional feast began with pack members breaking into smaller groups for food and conversation. Thomas found Aria near the back of the hall, her face composed despite the whispers that followed her. "Did you see?" She signed, her fingers trembling slightly. "I saw," Thomas confirmed quietly. "He recognized something in you." "Then why didn't he choose me?" Thomas glanced toward the dais where Ethan was engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation with Victor and several council members. "Politics," he said simply. "The king's choices are never just his own." As the evening progressed, Thomas kept a careful watch on both Aria and the strangers he had noticed earlier. The 3 outsiders had separated, moving through the crowd with deliberate casualness. The woman remained closest to Ethan, gradually working her way toward the high table. Concern prickling at the back of his neck, Thomas approached Marcus, who was stationed near one of the exits. "We have uninvited guests," he murmured, inclining his head slightly toward the woman. 3 of them. They entered through the east door about an hour ago." Marcus's expression didn't change, but his posture tensed. "You're certain they're not from one of the allied packs?" "Their scent is wrong. Northern Mountains, if I'm not mistaken." Marcus swore softly. "North Peak Pack. We've had border disputes with them for months." His eyes narrowed. "How did you notice when my guards didn't?" Thomas smiled grimly. "When you've been ignored long enough, you become very good at observing those who ignore you." With a sharp nod, Marcus moved off, speaking quietly into the radio clipped to his jacket. Thomas returned to Aria's side, keeping a protective presence beside her as the feast continued. As the evening was drawing to a close, Thomas found himself near enough to the council's table to overhear Victor speaking with several members. "The Alpha King's hunting trip tomorrow is confirmed. He'll be taking the northern path near Crescent Ridge." "Alone?" another council member asked, surprise evident in his tone. "It's his preference," Victor replied smoothly. "After tonight's tensions, he needs the solitude." Something in Victor's tone set off warning bells in Thomas's mind. Crescent Ridge bordered North Peak territory. For Ethan to hunt there alone, especially with uninvited North Peak wolves at tonight's ceremony, seemed an unnecessary risk. Before he could hear more, a commotion near the main doors drew everyone's attention. Marcus and his security team were escorting the three strangers out firmly but discreetly. Ethan stood, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Victor, explain." Victor rose smoothly, his expression perfectly balanced between concern and control. "Merely a misunderstanding, my king. Visitors who failed to follow proper protocols. Security is handling it." Ethan's silver gaze swept the hall, lingering briefly on Aria before returning to Victor. "Ensure that all security protocols are reviewed before tomorrow's council session. I want a full report." "Of course, my king." As the disruption settled, Thomas took Aria's arm. "I think it's time we departed." Outside, the night air was crisp with the promise of coming rain. Aria walked beside Thomas in silence, but her hands moved in the shadows. "Something is wrong. I could feel it." "Yes," Thomas agreed, his voice low. "And I fear it centers around our king. The way he looked at me was the way a wolf recognizes his true mate." Thomas stopped, turning to face her fully. "Aria, I believe you are Ethan's fated mate. The connection I saw tonight confirms what I've suspected since you first came to me." Her eyes widened, hands moving in urgent denial. "Impossible. I'm defective. Broken." "No," Thomas said firmly. "You are exactly as you should be. Your voice will return when it's ready. But even without it, you are whole. Ethan saw that tonight." "Then why?" "Politics," Thomas repeated. "The council, especially Victor, has been pressuring Ethan to choose a politically advantageous mate. Someone from a powerful family who can strengthen alliances. They wouldn't welcome his choice of a silent Omega with no family connections." Aria's shoulders slumped slightly. "But fate doesn't bow to politics," Thomas continued. "What I saw tonight was real, and dangerous given the current tensions within the pack." They had reached the point where their paths would diverge, Aria to her cottage, Thomas to his cabin. Rain had begun to fall, soft pattering against the leaves overhead. "Be careful tomorrow," Thomas warned. "Stay close to home if you can. I need to look into some matters, but I'll check on you in the evening." Aria nodded, then impulsively hugged him, her slender arms gentle around his still tender ribs. She pulled back and signed one last message before turning toward her cottage. "Thank you for standing with me tonight." Thomas watched until she was safely inside, then began the longer walk to his own cabin. His mind churned with what he had overheard: Ethan's planned hunting trip, the presence of North Peak wolves, Victor's too casual tone when discussing the king's solitary excursion. It painted a troubling picture, one that grew clearer with each step Thomas took through the rainy night. By the time he reached his cabin, he had made a decision. Tomorrow, while Ethan hunted near Crescent Ridge, Thomas would be watching from a distance. The old healer still had a duty to his king, whether the pack acknowledged it or not. And if his suspicions were correct, Ethan would need every ally he could find. Dawn broke in muted shades of gray as Thomas prepared for his self-appointed mission. The rain had continued through the night, turning the forest trails to slick mud. Perfect conditions for tracking and for ambush. Thomas moved methodically around his cabin, gathering supplies with the efficiency of a man who had spent decades in the field. Into his worn leather backpack went medical supplies, water-dried venison, and a small box containing his most potent herbal remedies. Last came his old military binoculars, still sharp enough to spot movement from half a mile away. His body protested as he shouldered the pack. Yesterday's injuries hadn't fully healed, an uncomfortable reminder that his werewolf regeneration had slowed with age. Once he would have recovered overnight. Now the deep bruising along his ribs would take days to fade. Another reason the younger pack members viewed elders as liabilities rather than assets. Thomas checked the hunting schedule he had accessed through the pack's shared calendar, a concession to modernity he grudgingly appreciated. Ethan would begin his solitary hunt at Crescent Ridge around noon, working his way north through the densely wooded slopes where elk herds gathered in early autumn. That gave Thomas time to reach a position where he could observe without being detected. He locked his cabin and set out following game trails that would keep him away from the main pack paths. The forest welcomed him like an old friend, familiar even in the gloomy half-light of the storm-darkened morning. 2 hours of steady hiking brought him to the eastern edge of Crescent Ridge. Thomas found a sheltered position on higher ground beneath the spreading branches of an ancient cedar tree. From here, he had a clear view of the main approach to the hunting grounds, while remaining hidden from casual observation. He settled in to wait using techniques honed during long surveillance missions. Control your breathing, minimize movement, become part of the landscape. Shortly before noon, a lone figure emerged from the forest below. Ethan moved with the confident grace of an apex predator dressed for hunting in dark clothing that blended with the wet foliage. He carried no rifle. Wolves hunted with their natural weapons when in their territories. Thomas tracked Ethan's progress through the binoculars, noting the tension in the Alpha King's posture. Last night's ceremony had clearly left him unsettled. Thomas wondered if the connection with Aria was still resonating within him, creating the same disturbance in his soul that Thomas had witnessed in her. Ethan paused at the bottom of the ridge, lifting his head to scent the air. For a moment, Thomas worried he might detect an older wolf's presence, but the steady rain washed away scents almost as quickly as they formed. After a moment, Ethan continued up the slope, moving deeper into the prime hunting territory. Thomas gave him 15 minutes, then began to follow at a safe distance, keeping to the natural cover of the forest. Years as a healer had taught him the movements of werewolf bodies in ways few others understood. He could predict Ethan's path by the way the Alpha's shoulders set the direction of his gaze, the subtle shifts in his weight. The rain intensified as the afternoon progressed. Thomas maintained his vigil, circling wide to keep Ethan in sight while staying downwind. The Alpha King moved with purpose, tracking an elk herd that had left fresh signs along the muddy ridge. 2 hours passed without incident. Thomas began to wonder if his suspicions had been unfounded. Perhaps Victor's interest in Ethan's hunting plans had been innocent. Perhaps the North Peak wolves at the ceremony were simply uninvited guests, not harbingers of trouble. Then the wind shifted, bringing with it new scents. Thomas stiffened his old instincts, screaming a warning. At least 3 unfamiliar wolves were approaching from the north, moving fast and with purpose. Their scent carried the distinctive musk of the North Peak pack, wilder, more aggressive than the Evergreen wolves. Thomas changed position, moving higher up the ridge to get a better view. Through his binoculars, he could see dark shapes slipping through the trees, converging on Ethan's position. The Alpha King remained unaware, focused on the elk tracks he was following. It was a classic ambush formation. Thomas had seen similar tactics in war: enemies flanking a target, cutting off escape routes, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had to warn Ethan without revealing his own presence to the North Peak wolves. A direct approach would put them both in danger. Instead, Thomas reached for a small pouch in his pack containing dried barula root, a plant that when crushed emitted a scent that wolves instinctively associated with danger. With practiced movements, Thomas crushed the root between his fingers and placed it on a flat stone. The rain would carry its scent downhill toward Ethan, hopefully alerting him without pinpointing Thomas's location. Within minutes, Ethan's posture changed. He straightened, abandoning the elk tracks to scan his surroundings with renewed vigilance. The barula root had worked. He was now alert to potential danger. But the warning came too late. 5 North Peak wolves burst from the underbrush, already shifted into their massive wolf forms. They had shed their human shapes for the raw power of their animal sides, a clear statement that this was no diplomatic encounter. Ethan reacted with impressive speed, dropping into a defensive crouch as his own shift began. The transformation from man to wolf usually took several seconds, precious time he didn't have with enemies closing in. Thomas watched in horror as the largest North Peak wolf, a scarred gray beast the size of a small horse, lunged for Ethan's throat while he was still mid-transformation. The Alpha King twisted away, but not quickly enough to avoid a deep slash across his shoulder from the attacker's claws. Despite the injury, Ethan completed his shift. His wolf form was magnificent, coal-black with silver-tipped fur along his spine, larger than any of his attackers. His silver eyes gleamed with cold fury as he faced the 5 wolves that had surrounded him. The fight that followed was brutal. Ethan fought with the skill of a born alpha, his movements a lethal combination of raw power and tactical precision. 2 of the North Peak wolves fell back bleeding from vicious bites to their haunches, but he was outnumbered, and the initial wound to his shoulder had slowed his left side. The scarred gray wolf coordinated the attacks with unnerving intelligence, driving Ethan toward a steep drop-off where his movements would be constrained. Thomas knew he had to act. Ethan might be the more powerful fighter, but 5 against 1 were impossible odds, especially with the strategic disadvantage of the terrain. Moving quickly despite his protesting ribs, Thomas circled to a position 30 yards above the fight. From his pack, he took a small clay pot sealed with beeswax, one of his more potent creations. Inside was a mixture of wolfsbane extract and crushed ghost pepper, suspended in pine resin. When ignited, it produced a smoke that caused intense discomfort to werewolf senses without causing permanent damage. It was a defensive tool he had developed for the pack's border guards years ago, though Victor had discontinued its use, preferring more modern and lethal weapons. Thomas struck a match and lit the short fuse protruding from the pot, then hurled it into the midst of the fighting wolves. The pot shattered on impact, and thick, acrid smoke billowed outward. The effect was immediate. The North Peak wolves recoiled, paws scraping at sensitive noses, eyes watering uncontrollably. Even Ethan was affected, backing away from the noxious cloud with a snarl of discomfort. But Thomas had calculated the wind direction. The smoke drifted primarily toward the North Peak wolves, creating a barrier between them and the Alpha King. Ethan, recognizing the unexpected advantage, seized the opportunity to break through the weakened circle of attackers. He tore into the gray leader jaws, clamping around the enemy wolf's throat with bone-crushing force. Blood sprayed across the wet ground. The leader collapsed, his body convulsing as death claimed him. The remaining North Peak wolves, disoriented by the smoke and demoralized by their leader's fall, retreated into the trees. Their howls of rage and grief echoed across the ridge as they fled northward, carrying the wounded with them. Ethan stood over his fallen enemy's sides, heaving with exertion, blood matting his black fur. The silver in his eyes seemed to glow with primal satisfaction at the victory. Then slowly his gaze lifted to the spot where Thomas stood, partially concealed by a cluster of young hemlocks. For a long moment, wolf and man stared at each other across the distance. Recognition flickered in those silver eyes, not just of Thomas as a pack member, but understanding of what had happened. Ethan knew he had been saved by the old healer's intervention. Thomas inclined his head in a gesture of respect. He expected the Alpha King to acknowledge him and then depart, perhaps shifting back to human form once he had recovered from the fight. Instead, Ethan's massive black form suddenly staggered, legs splaying awkwardly as he tried to maintain his balance. A tremor ran through his body, followed by another, more violent spasm. He collapsed beside the dead North Peak wolf, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Thomas was moving before conscious thought could intervene, medical instincts overriding caution. He scrambled down the steep slope, nearly losing his footing in his haste to reach the fallen king. Up close, the extent of Ethan's injuries became clear. The slash across his shoulder was deep, but it shouldn't have caused this level of distress. Thomas examined the wound carefully, his experienced hands parting the matted fur. There, almost invisible against the dark blood, was a greenish residue along the edges of the gash. Thomas recognized it immediately: wolfsbane extract mixed with nightshade, a potent neurotoxin specifically formulated to affect werewolf physiology. The North Peak wolves had coated their claws with poison. This was no territorial dispute or random attack. It was an assassination attempt. Ethan's breathing grew more labored, foam flecking his muzzle as the toxin spread through his system. His silver eyes found Thomas's face, intelligence still present despite the pain. A low whine escaped his throat, not a sound of weakness, but of warning. Thomas understood. They were exposed here, vulnerable to a return attack if the North Peak wolves gathered reinforcements. They needed to move to safety. "I need to get you somewhere I can treat this properly," Thomas said, keeping his voice low and steady despite the urgency pounding through his veins. "The poison is spreading fast. Can you walk at all?" Ethan struggled to rise, managing to get his front legs under him before collapsing again. The mighty Alpha King reduced to trembling weakness by an insidious poison. Thomas's heart clenched at the sight. "All right, different approach." Thomas scanned their surroundings. "There's a hunter's cabin about half a mile east. We can shelter there while I work on extracting the poison." The next challenge was how to move 200 pounds of wounded werewolf through difficult terrain. Thomas couldn't carry him, not with his own injuries still healing, but he could provide support. From his pack, Thomas retrieved a length of sturdy rope. He fashioned a harness around Ethan's chest, carefully avoiding the wounded shoulder, creating a support that would allow the wolf to use what strength remained in his legs, while Thomas took some of the weight. "This won't be comfortable," Thomas warned, "but it's our best option." Working together, they began the slow, painful journey toward the hunter's cabin. Ethan fought against the spreading paralysis with impressive determination, his powerful will refusing to surrender to the poison even as it coursed through his system. The rain continued to fall, washing away their scent trail, small mercy, in a situation that offered few. Thomas kept up a steady stream of quiet encouragement, the words as much for himself as for Ethan. Just a little further. You're doing well. The worst of the ridge is behind us now. They had covered perhaps a quarter mile when Ethan suddenly froze his head, lifting despite the obvious pain the movement caused. His nostrils flared, scenting something Thomas's human nose couldn't detect. A moment later, Thomas heard it too, the snap of a branch too deliberate to be weather or wildlife. Someone was following them. Thomas helped Ethan into the cover of a dense thicket, then retrieved his binoculars. Scanning back along their path, he caught movement among the trees, a lone figure moving with the careful precision of a tracker. It wasn't a North Peak wolf. The build and movement were familiar, though the rain and distance made identification difficult. Thomas adjusted the focus and felt a surge of relief as the figure's features became clear. Marcus Turner. The head of security was following their trail rifle in hand, moving with the alertness of a man expecting trouble. Whether he had been sent by the council or was acting on his own initiative, his presence was a welcome sight. Thomas was about to signal him when Ethan's body went rigid beside him. A harsh, rattling breath escaped the wolf's throat as his eyes rolled back, showing the whites. Seizure, one of the late-stage symptoms of the poison. Thomas abandoned any thought of signaling Marcus. The seizure required immediate attention. He knelt beside Ethan, using his pack to cushion the wolf's head as violent tremors shook the powerful body. "Stay with me," Thomas murmured, timing the seizure while monitoring Ethan's airway. "Fight it, Ethan. Your pack needs you." The seizure lasted just under 2 minutes longer than was safe, but not yet catastrophic. As the tremors subsided, leaving Ethan unconscious but breathing, Thomas knew they had run out of time. The cabin was still too far. He needed to begin treatment here in the open despite the risks. From his pack, Thomas withdrew a worn leather case containing pre-filled syringes, one of the few modern medical tools he still relied upon. Each contained a different herbal extract preserved in a solution that maintained potency for months. He selected a syringe filled with amber liquid extract of devil's claw root and white willow bark, combined with a rare mountain flower that grew only in the highest meadows of their territory. It was a powerful anti-inflammatory and pain reliever, specially formulated for werewolf physiology. As he prepared to administer the injection near the wound site, a voice spoke from just beyond the thicket. "That won't be enough for wolfsbane poisoning." Thomas didn't look up, recognizing Marcus's voice. "It will buy us time, but you're right, I need my full kit for the antidote." Marcus stepped into the clearing, his expression grim as he took in Ethan's condition. "How did this happen?" "Ambush. 5 North Peak wolves. Their claws were coated with poison." Thomas administered the injection, his movements precise despite his age. "Ethan killed their leader, but not before he was wounded." "And you just happened to be in the area when this occurred?" Marcus's tone was neutral, but the question itself carried weight. Thomas met his gaze steadily. "I overheard Victor discussing Ethan's hunting plans with unusual interest. After seeing North Peak wolves at the ceremony, I was concerned." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You're suggesting this wasn't random?" "I'm stating it plainly. This was an assassination attempt." Thomas checked Ethan's pulse, rapid but steady. The injection was working temporarily, slowing the poison's progress. "And I'm not convinced it originated solely with the North Peak pack." Marcus was silent for a long moment, his military training evident in the way he processed the information without immediate reaction. Finally, he slung his rifle and knelt on Ethan's other side. "What do you need from me, Doc?" "Help me get him to shelter. There's a cabin, the Carson place, about a quarter mile east." Marcus nodded. "I know it, but I have a better option. My Jeep is parked at the old logging road half a mile south. We can get him to your cabin much faster that way." Thomas shook his head. "Too risky. If the council is involved in this, your cabin would be the first place they'd look." "Then where?" Thomas considered their options. The poison would require at least 24 hours of treatment before Ethan would be strong enough to shift back and defend himself. They needed somewhere secure with access to medical supplies where the council wouldn't immediately look. "Aria's cottage," Thomas said finally. "It's remote defensible and she has many of the herbs I'll need. Plus the council barely remembers she exists." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes, recognition perhaps of the connection Thomas had noticed between Ethan and Aria at the ceremony. But he asked no questions, simply nodding his agreement. Can you stabilize him enough for transport? Thomas administered a second injection, this one to temporarily paralyze the muscles around the wound, slowing blood flow and the spread of toxins. That should hold him for the journey, but we need to move quickly. The poison is designed to kill within hours. Together, they fashioned a crude stretcher using Marcus's rain poncho and fallen branches. Getting Ethan onto it was a struggle. Even unconscious, the Alpha King was a massive weight of muscle and bone. But military experience had taught both men how to transport wounded comrades under difficult conditions. The journey to Marcus's jeep was arduous. The rain had intensified, turning the forest floor into a treacherous slide of mud and wet leaves. Twice they nearly lost their footing on steep descents, the stretcher threatening to slip from their grasp. By the time they reached the vehicle, Thomas's old injuries were screaming in protest, fresh blood seeping through his shirt where the barely healed gash on his arm had reopened. But the sight of the jeep, rugged and mud-splattered, perfectly camouflaged against the forest backdrop, brought a surge of relief. Loading Ethan into the back was another challenge, but they managed it with grim determination. Thomas climbed in beside him, continuing to monitor his condition, while Marcus took the wheel. "The main roads will be watched," Marcus said as he navigated the jeep along the narrow logging trail. "I'll take the old Forest Service roads. Longer route, but safer." Thomas nodded, too focused on Ethan to reply at length. The Alpha's condition was deteriorating despite the temporary treatments. His breathing had become shallow and irregular, his temperature dropping as the poison attacked his central nervous system. The jeep bounced and slid its way through the forest, Marcus driving, with the skill of a man who had spent decades patrolling these lands. Rain lashed against the windshield, reducing visibility to mere yards, but he never hesitated at junctions or slowed unnecessarily. "You knew this would happen," Marcus said after a long silence. "It wasn't a question." "I suspected something was wrong," Thomas corrected. "The timing was too convenient, North Peak wolves at the ceremony, Victor's interest in Ethan's hunting plans. But I didn't know it would be poison. That suggests planning resources, more than a simple territorial attack." "The Council." "Some of them, perhaps, not all." Thomas checked Ethan's pulse again. "Victor, certainly. Logan follows his lead. The others, I'm less certain." Marcus's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "I've served the pack for 20 years. The thought that council members would betray their king. Power corrupts," Thomas said simply. "And Victor has been accumulating power for years, positioning his allies in key roles. My removal was part of that pattern." "You think he wants to replace Ethan?" Marcus sounded skeptical. "The bloodlines wouldn't support it. The pack would never accept him as Alpha King. Perhaps he doesn't want the throne himself. Perhaps he wants a puppet he can control." Thomas's gaze fell to Ethan's unconscious form. "Or perhaps he simply wants to weaken the monarchy enough that the council becomes the true ruling body." The jeep turned onto an even narrower track, branches scraping against its sides as they descended toward the eastern borders of pack territory. The storm was lessening here, the heavy clouds beginning to break apart to reveal patches of late afternoon sky. "There's something else you should know," Thomas said quietly. "It concerns the ceremony last night." Marcus glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "The moment between Ethan and the silent girl." "Aria," Thomas corrected, a protective note entering his voice. "Yes, I believe she is his fated mate." The jeep swerved slightly as Marcus processed this information. "You're certain? As certain as one can be without the formal claiming. The recognition was mutual and powerful. I've seen it only once before, decades ago, between wolves whose bond became legendary within the pack." Marcus whistled softly. No wonder Victor looked ready to intervene. A fated mate would strengthen Ethan's position considerably, especially one outside Victor's influence. Aria has no family connections, no political value in the traditional sense. But her bond with Ethan would be unbreakable, something Victor couldn't control or manipulate. And now we're taking a poisoned Alpha King directly to his unclaimed mate's doorstep. Marcus shook his head, a grim smile touching his lips. "The political implications alone." "Politics be damned," Thomas said with sudden heat. "Ethan is dying. Aria's cottage is our best chance to save him. Everything else is secondary." Marcus didn't argue, focusing instead on navigating a particularly treacherous stretch of road where floodwater had carved channels through the dirt. They rode in silence for the remainder of the journey, each man lost in his own thoughts, as the implications of the day's events unfolded in their minds. Finally, the jeep slowed as they approached the narrow track leading to Aria's isolated cottage. Marcus killed the engine 100 yards away. "Better to approach on foot from here," he explained. "Less chance of being spotted or heard." Thomas nodded his agreement. "I'll go ahead and explain the situation to Aria. She'll be frightened enough without two men arriving unannounced with a wounded wolf." "I'll stay with him," Marcus said, gesturing to Ethan. "But hurry, Doc. His breathing is getting worse." Thomas made his way quickly along the muddy path leading to Aria's cottage. The small structure appeared peaceful in the fading daylight smoke rising from the chimney in a thin, steady stream. A single light glowed behind the curtained front window. He knocked on the door with their established pattern, 2 quick raps, a pause, then 3 more. It was a code they had developed during their lessons, a way for Aria to know it was him before opening her door to potential danger. The door opened almost immediately, revealing Aria's concerned face. She must have been watching from the window, perhaps alerted by some instinct that trouble was approaching. Her hands moved in rapid signs. "What's happened? You're injured again." "No time to explain fully," Thomas replied, his voice low and urgent. "Ethan has been attacked, poisoned. He needs immediate treatment. Marcus Turner is helping me. We need to bring him here." Aria's eyes widened, her fingers flying in shocked response. "The Alpha King, here. Why not the Pack Clinic?" "Because I believe members of the council may be involved in the attack." Thomas held her gaze, willing her to understand the gravity of the situation. "Aria, this is quite literally life or death. For him, and possibly for the Pack's future. Will you help us?" Without hesitation, she stepped back from the door, gesturing for him to enter. Her next signs were quick and decisive. "Bring him. I'll prepare what we need." Thomas felt a surge of pride at her immediate courage. "Marcus will help me carry him. Clear space near the fire, we need to keep him warm." As Aria hurried to prepare the cottage, Thomas returned to the jeep. Marcus had already lifted Ethan partially out of the vehicle, the unconscious wolf a dead weight in his arms. "She'll help," Thomas confirmed, positioning himself to take Ethan's hindquarters. "But we need to move fast. He's getting worse." Together they carried the Alpha King to Aria's cottage. It was a struggle over the uneven ground, made more difficult by the need to stay quiet and avoid being seen. By the time they reached the door, both men were breathing heavily from the exertion. Aria had transformed her small living space with remarkable efficiency. The area before the hearth was cleared, thick blankets laid out to create a pallet. Her table was covered with herbs, mortar, and pestle ready. A pot of water already hung over the fire, steam beginning to rise from its surface. Her eyes widened at the sight of Ethan's massive wolf form, but she showed no fear as she directed them to place him on the prepared blankets. Immediately, she knelt beside him, her healer's hands moving over his body with gentle precision, assessing his condition. Her fingers found the wound on his shoulder, identifying the discoloration that indicated poison. She looked up at Thomas, signing rapidly. "Wolfsbane and nightshade. Advanced stage. How long since exposure?" "Approximately 3 hours." Thomas answered, kneeling beside her. His old bones protested the movement, but he ignored the discomfort. "I've administered temporary countermeasures, but we need the full antidote." Aria nodded, already moving to her shelves of dried herbs. She selected several jars with quick, confident movements, bringing them to the table. Marcus watched them work with undisguised amazement. "You've taught her well, Doc." "She was born for this," Thomas replied simply, pride evident in his tone despite the dire circumstances. "Her grandfather was a gifted healer before me. The knowledge is in her blood." Together, Thomas and Aria began the complex process of creating the antidote. It required precise measurements of rare herbs, careful extraction of essential oils, and exact timing of each step. They moved in perfect synchrony, communicating through signs, nods, and occasional quiet words from Thomas. Marcus stationed himself by the window, rifle ready, keeping watch for any sign they had been followed or discovered. The cottage was silent, except for the crackle of the fire, the soft clink of glass jars, and Ethan's labored breathing. As Thomas crushed dried bloodroot with a mortar and pestle, adding it to the simmering mixture Aria was stirring, he explained the situation more fully to her through a combination of speech and signs. The North Peak wolves were waiting for him. It was a planned ambush with poison specifically designed to kill an alpha. Someone told them exactly where Ethan would be hunting today. Aria's hands paused in their work, her expression troubled as she signed her response. You think someone in our pack betrayed him? Yes. And I believe it was Victor, possibly with Logan's help. They've been consolidating power for months. With Ethan gone, they would control the council completely. But who would be Alpha, the bloodline? Would pass to Ethan's cousin Mitchell, a weak wolf who seldom attends council meetings. He would be a figurehead, nothing more. Marcus spoke up from his position by the window. There's something else to consider. What you saw at the ceremony last night between Ethan and Aria. Thomas nodded gravely. If Victor recognized what I did, that Aria is Ethan's fated mate, it would give him additional motivation to act quickly. A mated Alpha King with a true bond would be much harder to control or depose. Aria's hands stilled completely, her face paling at the implications. She looked down at the unconscious form of Ethan, seeing him not just as her king, but as something far more personal and profound. He knew me. When our eyes met, he knew me. Yes, Thomas confirmed gently. The recognition was clear to anyone with eyes to see it, which makes you both targets now. The gravity of the situation settled over the cottage like a physical weight. Aria resumed her work with renewed urgency, her slender fingers moving with increased precision as she completed the final stages of the antidote. The finished medicine was a thick, dark liquid that smelled strongly of earth and bitter herbs. Thomas checked its consistency carefully before nodding his approval. This needs to be administered directly into the wound, he explained, filling a large syringe with the mixture. The poison has spread too far for oral administration to be effective. Aria held Ethan's massive head steady while Thomas injected the antidote deep into the shoulder wound. The Alpha King's body tensed, a low growl escaping his throat. Despite his unconscious state, the medicine burned as it worked to neutralize the toxins. Now we wait, Thomas said, setting the empty syringe aside. The next few hours will be critical. If he survives until midnight, he has a chance. Aria signed a question that Thomas had been avoiding in his own mind. What if he dies here? What happens to the pack? To us? If Ethan dies, Marcus answered before Thomas could, his voice hard with suppressed emotion. The council will claim it was an attack by North Peak wolves alone. They'll use it to justify military action against our neighbors. There will be war, and anyone who questions the official story will be branded a traitor. And if he lives, Aria's signs were sharp with intensity. If he lives, Thomas said quietly, we still face danger. Victor won't stop with one failed attempt. And now we've involved ourselves directly in pack politics at the highest level. There's no going back from this. Aria's next signs were slow, deliberate, each movement imbued with determination. Then we make sure he lives, and we protect him until he can protect himself. Thomas felt a surge of admiration for the young woman before him. Silent she might be, but there was nothing weak or defective about Aria Harper. In that moment, he could see clearly why fate had chosen her as the match for their Alpha King. The cottage settled into a tense vigil as darkness fell outside. Aria tended to Ethan with gentle care, applying cooling cloths to his fever-hot fur, monitoring his breathing and pulse. Thomas prepared additional medications they might need throughout the night while Marcus maintained his watchful guard. 3 hours after administering the antidote, Thomas checked Ethan's wound again. The greenish discoloration had begun to recede, and the swelling was noticeably reduced. The Alpha's breathing, while still labored, had become more regular. The antidote is working, Thomas announced, relief evident in his voice. He's fighting the poison successfully. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Stubborn even while unconscious, that's our king. Aria's shoulders sagged slightly as tension drained from her body. She signed to Thomas, her movements betraying her exhaustion after the intense work of the past hours. What do we do now? Now, Thomas said, settling himself more comfortably beside the fire. We prepare for what comes next, because when Ethan wakes, everything changes. Outside the cottage, the storm had passed. Moonlight filtered through breaking clouds, casting silver light across the forest. In the distance, a wolf howled, a lone voice, soon joined by others, creating a chorus that rose toward the night sky. The pack was calling, searching for their missing king. But in the small cottage at the edge of their territory, Ethan Blackwood fought for his life in silence, surrounded by unlikely guardians. An aging healer, the council had discarded a security chief torn between duty and honor, and a mute Omega girl with the courage to defy generations of pack politics. Thomas looked from Aria's determined face to the powerful, vulnerable form of their Alpha King, and felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. This night marked a turning point not just for the 4 individuals gathered in this cottage, but for the entire Evergreen Pack. The old ways and the new were colliding, and from that collision would emerge either destruction or a new beginning. Thomas only hoped they would all survive to see which path their future would take. Dawn broke with tentative fingers of light reaching through Aria's curtain windows. Thomas awoke instantly, decades of military and medical training having conditioned him to transition from sleep to full alertness without the gradual awakening most people experienced. He had dozed in the old wooden chair by the hearth, his body protesting the uncomfortable position, but his mind unwilling to leave Ethan unattended. His first glance was toward the Alpha King. Ethan's massive wolf form lay still on the pallet of blankets, his black fur gleaming in the firelight. But the labored breathing of the previous night had eased. The wound on his shoulder, while still angry and raw, no longer carried the greenish tinge of poison. Aria was curled on the floor beside him, one slender hand resting lightly on Ethan's foreleg. She had refused to leave his side throughout the night, administering the follow-up treatments Thomas had prepared with unwavering precision. Now exhaustion had finally claimed her. Marcus stood at the window, his posture indicating he had been there for hours. The security chief's vigilance was a reassuring presence, though Thomas wondered how long any of them could continue at this pace. "He's improving," Thomas said softly, moving to check Ethan's vital signs. Marcus glanced over his shoulder, the weariness in his eyes momentarily lightened by hope. Will he be able to shift back soon? It was the question that had concerned them all night. In wolf form, Ethan remained vulnerable, unable to communicate, unable to defend himself properly if they were discovered. But the shifting process required enormous energy his body was currently directing toward healing. "Not yet," Thomas replied after a careful assessment. "The poison has been neutralized, but the damage to his system is extensive. Forcing a shift now could kill him." Marcus nodded grimly, returning his attention to the forest outside. "We have another problem. The council has organized search parties. They're methodically combing the territory starting from Crescent Ridge and working outward." "How long until they reach this area?" "Mid-afternoon at the earliest. But that assumes they maintain their current pattern. If something makes them suspect this location specifically..." The implication hung in the air between them. If Victor had any reason to believe Ethan might be brought to Aria's cottage, the search would be redirected immediately. Thomas moved to wake Aria, gently touching her shoulder. She came awake with the same immediate alertness he had shown, her eyes focusing first on Ethan before looking up at Thomas with a question in her gaze. "How is he better?" Thomas assured her. "The fever has broken and his pulse is stronger, but he needs more time before he can shift." "And we don't have much time," she signed, glancing toward Marcus at the window. "The council is searching," Thomas confirmed. "We need to prepare for the possibility they'll find us." Aria's response was immediate and decisive. "Then we need a plan, not just to hide, but to expose the truth." Thomas felt a surge of pride at her courage. This young woman, whom the pack had dismissed as broken, possessed a core of strength that put many alphas to shame. "Marcus," Thomas called softly, "we need to talk strategy, all of us." The security chief joined them by the hearth, his expression grave. "I've been thinking about our options. None of them are ideal." "Share them anyway," Thomas prompted. "Perfect solutions are a luxury we don't have." Marcus crouched beside them, keeping his voice low as though concerned that even here they might be overheard. "Option 1. We hide Ethan here and hope the search parties miss this cottage. Risky given how methodical Victor's people can be." Aria signed her response, which Thomas translated for Marcus. "This cottage is registered in pack records. They'll check it eventually, even if it's low priority." "Exactly," Marcus agreed. "Option 2. We move Ethan to a new location, but transporting an injured alpha wolf without being seen in daylight is nearly impossible. And he's still too weak to travel far," Thomas added. "What's option 3? Marcus hesitated, his military training evident in the way he assessed potential risks before speaking. "Option 3 is more aggressive. We gather evidence of Victor's betrayal and take it directly to the pack elders, bypassing the council entirely." This sparked Thomas's interest. The pack elders, werewolves over 70 years old who had retired from active leadership, still held ceremonial authority. In cases of disputed succession or suspected treason, they could theoretically intervene. "What evidence do we have?" Thomas asked. "Suspicion isn't enough to accuse a council head of attempted regicide." We have the poison itself, Marcus pointed out. It's unique, a specific formula used exclusively by the North Peak Pack. I recognized it from border skirmishes. The question is, how did Victor acquire it, and how did he coordinate with North Peak wolves? Aria's hands moved in excited signs. The visitors at the ceremony, the strangers you saw. Could they have been the contact? Possible, Thomas acknowledged. But proving a connection between them and Victor would be difficult. We need something more concrete. They fell silent, each considering the challenge before them. The cottage was quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire and Ethan's steady breathing. Then unexpectedly, a low rumbling sound emerged from the Alpha King's throat. All three turned to see Ethan's silver eyes open, alert and aware, despite the pain that still creased his features. He was conscious, observing their conversation with the intense focus that had always marked him as a natural leader. Ethan? Thomas moved quickly to his side, medical instincts taking over. Don't try to shift yet. The poison has been neutralized, but your body needs more time to heal. The massive black wolf gave a slight nod of understanding, his intelligent gaze moving from Thomas to Marcus and finally settling on Aria. Something profound passed between them, a recognition that transcended words or even conscious thought. Aria's hand moved to rest gently on his head, and Ethan leaned into the touch, accepting her care with a trust that seemed instinctive rather than considered. The king is awake, Marcus said, relief evident in his voice. That changes things. Indeed it did. Even in wolf form, a conscious alpha could communicate basic intentions and understand complex situations. Ethan's awareness gave them options they hadn't had before. Thomas addressed the wolf directly, knowing Ethan would understand, despite being unable to respond verbally. We believe Victor Hayes orchestrated the attack on you, working with North Peak wolves. The council is organizing search parties allegedly to find you, but possibly to ensure you don't return alive. He paused, making sure Ethan was following. We need evidence to prove Victor's treachery to the pack elders. Ethan's silver eyes narrowed, a growl rumbling deep in his chest at the mention of Victor's betrayal. Then with obvious effort, he shifted his massive head toward the doorway, then back to Thomas. The meaning was clear, he wanted to leave. You're not strong enough to travel, Thomas objected, concerned by the Alpha's eagerness to confront the danger directly. The poison damaged your nervous system. You need at least another day before attempting to shift back to human form. Ethan's response was a low, insistent whine. He tried to rise, his powerful legs trembling with the effort before collapsing back onto the blankets. Aria placed a restraining hand on his shoulder, her expression stern despite the gentleness of her touch. She signed rapidly, and Thomas translated for Ethan's benefit. Aria says you'll be no use to the pack dead, which is what you'll be if you push yourself too soon. The healing process cannot be rushed, even for an Alpha King. A frustrated huff escaped Ethan, but he stopped attempting to rise. His silver eyes remained alert, watching as the three of them resumed their strategic discussion. If we can't move Ethan safely and staying here is risky, then we need to focus on gathering evidence, Thomas reasoned. Something concrete that connects Victor to the North Peak wolves. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Victor keeps private records in his office at the council building. He's meticulous about documentation, a habit from his corporate days. If there's evidence, it would be there. Can you access his office? Thomas asked. Not easily. It's kept locked and there are usually council staff present. Marcus frowned, considering the obstacles. But not tonight. The full moon hunt will draw most of the pack to the northern clearings. The council building should be minimally staffed. The full moon hunt, a monthly tradition when most pack members shifted to their wolf forms for a communal hunt. Thomas had forgotten it was scheduled for tonight, having been preoccupied with his own concerns recently. The timing was fortuitous. So you'll search Victor's office during the hunt, Thomas said, the outline of a plan forming in his mind. What about the North Peak connection? We need to prove they were working with him specifically, not just attacking our Alpha King on their own initiative. Aria's hands moved in decisive signs. The leader, Ethan, killed. What happened to his body? It was an excellent question. In the chaos of Ethan's injury and their flight, the corpse of the North Peak leader had been left behind on Crescent Ridge. Standard protocol would be retrieval by pack security, Marcus answered. The body would be examined, then either returned to North Peak as a diplomatic gesture or cremated depending on the circumstances. Who would perform the examination? Thomas asked, though he suspected the answer. Dr. Chen, the new head physician, Marcus replied, confirming Thomas's concern. Under normal circumstances. Under normal circumstances. But these were far from normal circumstances. If Victor was indeed orchestrating a coup, he would want to control every aspect of the investigation. He'll handle it himself, Thomas predicted. He wouldn't risk having Dr. Chen find evidence of the poison or anything else that might contradict his narrative of the attack. Marcus considered this, then nodded grimly. You're right. Victor would insist on overseeing the examination personally. And if there's any evidence linking him to North Peak, he'll destroy it. Unless we find it first, Aria signed her expression determined. The body would be kept in the examination room at the security compound, Marcus said. Access is restricted, but as head of security I can enter without raising suspicion. A plan was taking shape, dangerous, but with potential to expose the truth. Marcus would examine the North Peak leader's body, seeking evidence of coordination with Victor, while also searching the council head's office for incriminating documents. What about us? Thomas asked, gesturing to himself, Aria, and the wounded Ethan. We remain here and hope the search parties overlook this cottage. Aria shook her head decisively. Too risky. We need a distraction, something to draw the search away from this area entirely. She was right. They needed to redirect the search parties, giving Ethan more time to heal, and Marcus more freedom to gather evidence. But what kind of distraction would be significant enough to divert all attention from the eastern borders where Aria's cottage stood? The answer came from an unexpected source. Ethan, who had been listening intently to their discussion, suddenly gave a sharp bark, a sound of realization. With obvious effort, he extended one massive paw toward Thomas, the claws scraping against the wooden floor in a deliberate pattern. Thomas recognized the behavior immediately. He wants to write something. Aria quickly retrieved a sheet of paper and a piece of charcoal from her drawing supplies. She placed them on the floor within reach of Ethan's paw. With remarkable dexterity for a wolf, Ethan dragged the charcoal across the paper. The result was crude but legible 3 letters. NPC. Marcus stared at the letters, confusion evident on his face. North Peak. What? Cub. Thomas breathed, understanding dawning. North Peak Cub. He turned to Ethan. The bundle you were protecting when you were attacked. It wasn't just any pup. It was the child of the North Peak leader. Ethan's silver eyes confirmed the guess with a distinct gleam of approval. This revelation changed everything. If Ethan had been protecting a North Peak cub during the attack, it suggested a complexity to the situation they hadn't considered. Why would the Alpha King of Evergreen Pack be safeguarding the offspring of a rival pack's leader? The North Peak leader who attacked you, Thomas said slowly. He wasn't trying to kill you initially. He was trying to recover his child. Another nod from Ethan. But why did you have the cub in the first place? Marcus asked, clearly struggling to make sense of this new information. Ethan scratched at the paper again. This time the message was longer, his paw struggling to form the letters clearly. Mother asked, dying. Thomas pieced together the implications. The cub's mother asked for your protection. She was dying. Ethan nodded, then added one more word to the paper. Sister. The room fell silent as the full picture emerged. The North Peak leader's mate, the mother of the cub, had been Ethan's sister. Not by blood perhaps, but by some bond strong enough that she had entrusted him with her child as she lay dying. Your sister married into the North Peak Pack, Thomas said, understanding now. When she was dying, she asked you to protect her child. You went to retrieve the cub, but were ambushed not by her mate, but by others who saw an opportunity. Ethan's eyes clouded with grief, but he nodded confirmation. Victor must have learned about the cub, Marcus reasoned. He used the situation to set a trap, telling the North Peak wolves where to find you, providing them with the poison. From their perspective, you had stolen their future alpha. From Victor's perspective, it was a perfect opportunity to eliminate you. Where is the cub now? Aria signed her expression concerned. All eyes turned to Ethan, who scratched a final message on the increasingly crowded paper. Hidden. Safe. The cub is our distraction, Thomas said, the plan crystallizing in his mind. If we can make Victor believe Ethan hid the North Peak heir somewhere in the Western Territories, he'll redirect the search parties there away from us. Marcus nodded slowly, seeing the strategy. It could work. Victor would be desperate to find the cub, both to eliminate a potential complication and to use as leverage with North Peak. How do we plant this information? Aria asked. Through Logan, Thomas decided. He's ambitious, but not particularly clever. If he believes he's discovered valuable information Victor doesn't yet have, he'll rush to be the one to deliver it. The plan took shape quickly. Marcus would return to the Pack compound, ostensibly rejoining the search efforts. He would accidentally reveal to Logan that there were signs of Ethan traveling toward the western caves with a bundled package. The suggestion of a North Peak cub would be planted through carefully chosen words, allowing Logan to believe he was piecing together the truth himself. Meanwhile, during the full moon hunt that evening, Marcus would examine the North Peak leader's body and search Victor's office. If he found evidence linking Victor to the ambush, he would bring it directly to Elder Jackson, the most respected member of the Pack elders. And us, Thomas gestured to himself, Aria, and Ethan. What's our role? We heal him, Aria signed simply. We prepare for whatever comes next. It was not the active role Thomas might have preferred, but he recognized the wisdom in it. His greatest contribution to the Pack right now was ensuring their Alpha King recovered completely. Marcus departed shortly after carrying with him their hopes for justice. Thomas watched him disappear into the forest, aware that they were placing enormous trust in the security chief's discretion and abilities. With Marcus gone, the cottage seemed quieter, more isolated. Thomas turned his attention back to Ethan's treatment, preparing a fresh poultice for the wound. Aria worked alongside him, her movements confident and precise as she ground herbs with mortar and pestle. He needs protein to rebuild his strength, Thomas noted. Game would be best something freshly caught. Aria nodded, setting aside her work to retrieve a hunting knife from a drawer. She signed briefly. I'll check my traps. There might be rabbit. Be careful, Thomas cautioned. Stay close to the cottage. If you see any sign of search parties. I know, she interrupted with a firm gesture. I've avoided Pack attention for years. I know how to move unseen. After she left, Thomas found himself alone with Ethan. The Alpha watched him with those intelligent silver eyes, following every movement as Thomas prepared medications and checked the healing wound. You recognized her immediately, didn't you? Thomas said conversationally as he worked. At the ceremony, you knew she was your mate. Ethan's ears flicked forward in affirmation. The old stories say true mates can sense each other from the moment of first meeting, that the wolf inside knows its other half instantly. Thomas smiled slightly. I saw it happen once before, decades ago. My grandfather called it soul recognition, something deeper than scent or sight or sound. Ethan made a soft sound somewhere between a whine and a rumble. Yes, it's rare, Thomas agreed, interpreting the sound correctly. And politically inconvenient in your case. Victor would never approve a match with a defective Omega with no family connections. A low growl vibrated from Ethan's chest. My sentiments exactly, Thomas said dryly. Aria is far from defective. Her silence isn't weakness, it's a response to trauma. And it hasn't stopped her from becoming one of the most gifted healers I've ever trained. He finished applying the fresh poultice, then sat back on his heels, regarding the Alpha King thoughtfully. You should know her voice is returning, slowly, in private. I've heard her whisper to plants as she tends them. Single words, sometimes short phrases. The healing has begun, though she may not fully realize it yet. Ethan's silver eyes widened slightly at this information. The true mate bond might accelerate that healing, Thomas continued. The old texts speak of mates completing each other, filling the empty spaces, healing old wounds. If you claimed her properly, the implication hung in the air between them. A proper claiming the ritual that would bind Alpha and Omega in a lifelong bond could only occur when both parties were in human form, capable of speaking the ancient vows. Ethan's gaze became distant, considering possibilities and complications. Then he looked back at Thomas with a question in his eyes. Yes, I believe she would accept you, Thomas answered the unspoken query. Despite your rather intimidating reputation, she's not one to be swayed by rumors or frightened by power. A different sound emerged from Ethan, then something almost like a chuckle. It was heartening to hear a sign that the Alpha spirit remained strong even as his body healed. The moment was interrupted by the cottage door opening as Aria returned. She carried 2 rabbits already skillfully dressed and ready for cooking. Her keen eyes moved between Thomas and Ethan, noting the atmosphere. What were you talking about? She signed after setting the rabbits aside. The healing properties of true mate bonds. Thomas replied honestly, seeing no reason to hide their conversation. and the politics that complicated your meeting at the ceremony. Aria's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't shy away from the topic. Her hands moved in careful signs. Is it true then? What I felt when our eyes met, Thomas glanced at Ethan, who was watching Aria with an intensity that needed no translation. Yes, he said simply. It's true. You are his fated mate, and he is yours. The implications of this truth filled the small cottage. Under normal circumstances, the discovery of a true mate was cause for celebration throughout the pack. The pair would be honored, their union blessed by elders, their future bright with promise. But these were not normal circumstances. Their Alpha King lay wounded, unable to shift, while members of his own council plotted against him. The recognition of mates had become not just a personal milestone, but a political complication with far-reaching consequences. Aria seemed to understand this perfectly. Her signs were pragmatic rather than romantic. First we heal him, then we deal with Victor. Only then can we consider what this means for us. Thomas translated for Ethan's benefit, though the Alpha's gaze suggested he had understood her meaning regardless. The king gave a solemn nod of agreement, respecting her priorities. As Aria prepared the rabbit stew, Thomas found himself reflecting on the strange turns his life had taken. 6 months ago, he had been a respected healer, secure in his position, if increasingly aware of Victor's growing influence. Now he was essentially a fugitive, harboring his wounded king in a remote cottage involved in pack politics at the highest and most dangerous level. Yet he felt more alive, more purposeful than he had in years. His knowledge was valued again, his experience essential rather than dismissed as outdated. In Aria, he had found not just a student, but a successor who would carry traditional healing knowledge into the future. And in Ethan, he had found a leader worth fighting for, one who recognized worth beyond political expedience. The afternoon passed in quiet productivity. Thomas and Aria took turns monitoring Ethan's condition, which improved steadily as the hours passed. By late afternoon, the Alpha could stand for short periods, though walking remained difficult. His silver eyes were clear and alert, following their movements with increasing impatience. You want to shift back, Thomas observed as he changed the bandage on Ethan's shoulder. I understand, but your body needs more time. The poison targeted your central nervous system. Shifting now could trigger seizures or worse. Ethan's frustration was evident in the tense set of his powerful shoulders, but he didn't attempt to contradict Thomas's medical judgment. Aria approached with a bowl of the rabbit stew, the rich aroma filling the cottage. She set it before Ethan, who regarded the offering with what could only be described as resignation. Eating in wolf form was undignified for any werewolf, especially an Alpha King accustomed to impeccable manners in human form. Seeming to sense his discomfort, Aria turned away, busying herself at the hearth to give him privacy. Thomas followed her lead, focusing on preparing the evening's medications rather than watching Ethan eat. It was a small courtesy, but the Alpha's appreciative rumble suggested it was noted and valued. As dusk approached, Thomas found himself increasingly anxious about Marcus. By now, their distraction plan should have been implemented. The search parties would either be redirecting to the Western Territories or continuing their methodical progression toward Aria's cottage. We should prepare for the possibility that the plan failed, Thomas said quietly to Aria as they worked side by side. If search parties appear, you'll need to leave immediately through the back. There's a ravine half a mile south that could provide cover. Aria's response was immediate and definitive. I won't leave either of you. Aria, no. Her signs were emphatic. My place is here, with both of you. I can help defend if necessary. Thomas knew better than to argue. The determined set of her jaw reminded him painfully of her grandfather, a man who had stood his ground against far worse threats than pack politics. Very well, he conceded. But if it comes to the worst, remember that your survival is essential. You carry knowledge that must not be lost. Sometimes retreat is the braver choice. Before she could respond, a sharp sound cut through the evening quiet. 3 quick taps on the window, followed by 2 more. Marcus's signal. Thomas moved quickly to the door, opening it just enough to verify the security chief's identity before allowing him inside. Marcus entered swiftly, his expression a complex mixture of triumph and concern. The distraction worked, he reported without preamble. Search parties had been redirected to the Western Territories. Logan was eager to share the discovery with Victor exactly as we predicted. And the evidence, Thomas prompted. Marcus withdrew a small leather pouch from inside his jacket. Two things. First, fibers found on the North Peak leader's claws, identical to the material of Victor's ceremonial robe. They met recently in close proximity. That's suggestive but not conclusive, Thomas noted. This is more definitive. Marcus opened the pouch, carefully extracting a small glass vial containing traces of dark liquid, found hidden in a compartment in Victor's desk. It's the same poison used on Ethan. The chemical signature is distinctive. Ethan's growl rumbled through the cottage at the sight of the poison that had nearly killed him. What about communication with North Peak? Thomas asked. Any proof of coordination? Better, Marcus said, a grim smile touching his lips. I found financial records. Victor has been paying significant sums to someone called Highland Consulting for months. It's a shell company controlled by the North Peak beta Gregory Kinnear. This was the evidence they needed: concrete proof of an ongoing relationship between Victor and high-ranking members of the North Peak Pack, including financial transactions that would be difficult to explain innocently. Have you taken this to Elder Jackson? Thomas asked, hope rising for the first time in days. Marcus's expression darkened. That's the problem. Elder Jackson is missing. According to his housekeeper, he left yesterday evening after receiving an urgent message. No one has seen him since. The implications were chilling. Elder Jackson was their best hope for intervention against Victor. His disappearance, coinciding with the attempt on Ethan's life, suggested Victor's plans were more extensive than they had realized. We need to assume the worst, Thomas said grimly. Victor may be eliminating potential opposition systematically. Aria signed a question that cut to the heart of their predicament. What do we do now? Without the elders who can stand against the council. The cottage fell silent as they confronted the reality of their situation. Victor controlled the council, had potentially neutralized the elders, and commanded the loyalty of most pack officials. Their evidence meant nothing without a legitimate authority to present it to. It was Ethan who broke the impasse. The Alpha King rose to his feet with deliberate effort, his powerful body trembling slightly, but his silver eyes blazing with determination. He moved slowly to the center of the room, then did something none of them expected. He began to shift. Ethan, no. Thomas moved forward, alarmed. Your system isn't ready. But the transformation had already begun. Bones cracked and realigned as the massive wolf form contorted fur receding into skin muzzle, shortening into a human face. The process, normally completed in seconds, stretched agonizingly as Ethan's damaged nervous system struggled to execute the complex transformation. Thomas watched with professional dread and personal anguish, knowing he could not intervene in a shift once begun. Stopping midway would cause more damage than completing the painful process. Aria gripped his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve as they witnessed the Alpha King's suffering. Marcus stood rigid, his face pale beneath his tan. After what seemed an eternity, the shift completed. Where the massive black wolf had stood, a man knelt on the cottage floor, tall, powerfully built, with the same silver eyes that had marked his wolf form. Ethan Blackwood. Alpha King of the Evergreen Pack, naked and trembling from exertion, but unmistakably, undeniably present in his human form. Help me up, he commanded, his voice rough from disuse, but carrying the natural authority that had made him king. Thomas and Marcus moved forward, immediately supporting Ethan as he rose to his full height. Aria quickly retrieved a blanket, offering it with downcast eyes in a gesture of traditional Omega respect. Ethan accepted the covering with a nod of thanks, wrapping it around his waist before addressing them all. I've heard everything, he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. I understand the situation we face. Victor's betrayal, the elders compromised the pack in danger. His silver gaze swept over them. You three have shown courage and loyalty beyond measure. Now I ask for your trust, as I tell you what must happen next. Thomas felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. Whatever Ethan proposed would be dangerous, probably desperate, but they had come too far to turn back now. We're listening, my king, he said simply. Ethan's plan was as bold as it was perilous. Rather than hiding or seeking outside support, they would confront Victor directly at the height of the full moon hunt before the entire assembled pack. A public accusation cannot be quietly disposed of, Ethan explained, his strategic mind evident despite his physical weakness. Victor's power comes from controlling the narrative. We must shatter that control in a way he cannot contain or deny. The hunt begins at moonrise, Marcus noted, checking his watch. That's less than 2 hours from now. Enough time to prepare, Ethan replied with grim determination. Enough time for what must be done. As they discussed the details, Thomas found himself watching Aria. She had retreated slightly, her expressive eyes fixed on Ethan with a complex mixture of emotions, concern, admiration, and something deeper that belonged only to true mates who had recognized each other but not yet claimed the bond. When Ethan finally looked directly at her, the cottage seemed to hold its breath. Alpha King and silent Omega, their connection transcending the chaos that surrounded them. Aria. Ethan said her name like a prayer on his lips. I would speak with you alone if Thomas and Marcus would grant us a moment. It was not truly a request despite the polite phrasing. Thomas inclined his head in acknowledgement, gesturing for Marcus to follow him outside. They stepped onto the small porch, closing the door to give the pair privacy. The night air was cool against Thomas's face, the forest quiet except for the distant calls of nightbirds. Above, the moon was rising nearly full, a silver disk emerging from behind scattered clouds. Do you think this will work? Marcus asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the moon. Confronting Victor before the pack. Thomas considered the question carefully. It depends on the pack itself, on whether enough members remember what it means to be Evergreen wolves, not just Victor's followers. He sighed, feeling the weight of his years. My greatest fear is not that we'll fail, but that we'll succeed only to find the damage is too extensive to repair. Marcus nodded grimly. Some wounds don't heal clean. But they do heal, Thomas countered, drawing on his lifetime of medical experience. Given time, proper care, and the body's natural wisdom. The same is true for packs. They stood in companionable silence for several minutes, each man lost in his thoughts as the moon continued its ancient journey across the sky. Then the cottage door opened behind them. Ethan emerged now, dressed in clothes Marcus had brought from the pack compound, dark jeans and a simple black Henley that did nothing to diminish his regal bearing. The wound on his shoulder was freshly bandaged, nearly invisible beneath the fabric. Only the pallor of his skin and a certain carefulness in his movements betrayed his recent brush with death. Aria followed, her face composed, but her eyes bright with emotion. Something had passed between them in that private conversation, some promise or decision that had brought both resolution and new tension. It's time, Ethan said simply. The pack awaits its alpha. Thomas looked at the three people before him, the wounded king standing tall despite his pain, the security chief bound by honor rather than ambition, the silent healer whose strength lay in her compassion rather than her voice. An unlikely alliance against corruption, an improbable defense of tradition against those who would discard the old ways in the name of progress. As they set off toward the pack gathering grounds, Thomas felt a curious lightness in his chest. Whatever happened in the hours to come, he had found his purpose again. His knowledge mattered. His experience had value. His legacy would continue through Aria. At 68, when many considered him obsolete, Thomas Griffin had become essential once more to the future of the Evergreen Pack. The moon illuminated their path as they walked into the heart of the coming storm, four defenders of a truth that could not be silenced.